Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. This podcast avoids stereotypes and biases in favor of the lived experiences of those we can best learn from. Now, please welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 105 of The Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. In this episode, we are joined once again by friend of the show, Dr. Jerrod Brown from Concordia University in St. Paul. We are taking a bit of a detour from our usual topics and guest by profiling a historical case study. Jerrod is going to be sharing his insights and research around infamous serial killer Albert Fish. If you have never heard of the case of Albert Fish, it could be because he committed his horrific acts in the early 20th century. And so when we think of or reference the so-called golden age of serial killers in the United States from the 1970s through the 80s, he is not in that cohort of killers. Nonetheless, his case does make for a good template, if you will, to study some topics related to crime and deviance. Please know that we are not glamorizing or doing this for shock value, but rather to use this to illustrate his crimes and behaviors as a case study for all to learn from. As noted, Dr. Brown is a friend of the show, has made multiple guest appearances on this podcast in the past. I encourage you to go back and listen to all of those. He is a wealth of information. By way of introduction, for those of you who may not have caught any of those episodes, Jerrod Brown, PhD, is a professor, trainer, researcher, and consultant with multiple years of experience teaching collegiate courses. He is currently an assistant professor, program director, and lead developer for the Master of Arts degree in Human Services with an emphasis in forensic behavioral mental health and a second emphasis area in trauma, resilience, and self-care strategies for Concordia University in St. Paul, Minnesota. Jerrod's going to tell you a little bit about himself when he joins me shortly, but I want to get to this interview because it is so fascinating. So please enjoy my interview with Dr. Jerrod Brown, talking all about Albert Fish, and I will see you all on the other side. Welcome back to the show, Dr. Jerrod Brown from Concordia University. You've been on the show a few times in the past, and today I'm very excited because we are going to try something a little bit different here on the Criminologist podcast. I love illustrating concepts through case studies. Jerrod, I know I've seen several of your trainings and experienced your learning teaching style as well, rather. And I know you like to lean into case studies, as do a lot of professionals. So I'm excited today to announce that we are going to use a historical case study to illustrate some points, some themes we talk about quite a bit on the program. And the case study, rather, is going to be that of the infamous serial killer, among other things, Albert Fish. Born in 1870, go ahead and tell our listeners, maybe first off, Jerrod, a little bit about Albert Fish in general, and then we'll drill down to some more of these topics that you and I are going to roll our sleeves up and discuss.
Absolutely. Thanks, Joe, for having me back. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. This is a really interesting case study. I actually published an article a handful of years ago with some colleagues of mine. If you want to, you can just go online and Google my name and type in Albert Fish article, or Joe, if you want to link that up to this podcast. It kind of just summarizes what we're talking about today. But we're going to talk about some heavy duty stuff. This individual was a very deviant, violent, sadistic serial killer. He's probably one of the more well-known serial killers that are talked about in criminology books. If you go online and Google his name, you're going to find tons of different websites and criminology pages that just discuss his history. There's a lot we do know about his history, but after going through all of articles written on him, looking at books that have focused on him, there's so much we don't know as well. I've given a handful of talks over the years on the topic of Mysopeds. He's a Mysoped. He's a classic example of a Mysoped. If you type in Mysopeds in my name, you'll find, I think, a couple articles online related to that topic. In my opinion, a Mysoped is probably the most violent, dangerous individual on the planet.
Go ahead. I was going to say, Dr. Brown, go ahead and give our listeners just the textbook definition of a Mysoped.
It's an older term you'll see in the criminology literature. A lot of researchers now don't use that term, but Mysopeds are really sadistic homicide offenders of children. They sometimes engage in cannibalism, necrophilia. It is not uncommon for that type of individual to engage in overkill. So after the individual has died, they continue to do horrific things to the body, removing certain parts. Albert Fish is a classic Mysoped, one of the more common ones that come up when they talk about Mysoped case studies. Done a couple talks on the topic, just fascinating, dark, disturbing topic. I started studying this topic because I really want to get deep in the weeds and understanding the most violent types of criminal behavior. Because if you can understand that, I'm hoping that through trainings and talks like this, most people are never going to grow up and do these things, thank goodness. But maybe there's certain traits and behavioral characteristics that maybe you're working with young kids. And if we could detect those things early on and implement some support services strategies, that might veer them away from certain criminal behavior. And again, by no means what I'm talking about today, if you are working with a client with some of these behavioral profiles, the overwhelming majority of people never grow up to do these things. Albert Fish, obviously the big question is, why did he do this? He has been referred to as a sadistic pedophile, a Mysoped, a child molester, a rapist, a cannibal. He's one of the most deviant killers in American history. If you go on all kinds of websites, these are certain things that people consistently say about him. A couple sources say that he holds the record for the most documented sexual paraphilias of any killer out there. Again, I don't know if that's true or not, but he sure had a number of different sexual paraphilias. He was born in Washington, D.C. on May 19th, 1870. He was born, his birth name was Hamilton Fish, but he later changed that to Albert Fish. I'll talk a little bit about that today. Here's an interesting fact just to keep in the back of your mind. When he was born, his dad was 75 years of age and his mom was 32 years of age.
Wow.
What about genetics? The first thing pops in my mind is there's some genetic things going on with him. Fish died on, I believe, January 16th, 1936. Cause of death, execution. He was apprehended and sentenced and executed to the electric chair. If you go online and if you look at some of these criminology books and different things like that, a lot of different names have been attached to him. The Gray Man has been a name. The Werewolf of Wisteria, the Brooklyn Vampire, the Boogeyman, the Moon Maniac. So a lot of different things. If we look at just his crime history, what we know from just these books and different sources and his own accounts, and again, when we talk about accounts from a serial killer. Are they telling the truth? Are they fabricating? We don't know. But he was arrested 8 times, according to the records that are out there, passing bad checks, grand larceny, murder, stalking, larceny. He engaged in prostitution himself, supposedly, abduction, strangulation, cannibalism. He's a self-admitted molester. He claimed, or some people state, that he might have molested over 400 children during a 20-year span. Unknown if that number is accurate, if it's inflated, or if it's underreported. We just don't know. We also don't know when he started to murder. He confessed to killing 6 people, but referred to multiple other victims. But again, we don't know. So that's a little bit about his crime history. Joe, any thoughts, anything you want me to go into with his crime history, and before I move into family history?
Maybe not so much crime history, Jerrod, but as you said, let's maybe take a step back. There's a lot we don't know about him, but what do we know, for example, about his childhood? One of the things we talk about on this podcast all the time is the fact, rather, that there are various pathways into criminality and delinquency. Let's take a look at, again, maybe some of those pathways. Describe for us what we know about the childhood of Albert Fish.
He was born into a family with severe mental health problems. What we know from the records and what's reported out there in the literature, his mother suffered from auditory and visual hallucinations. At least 7 of his family members were dealing with severe mental health issues. 2 of them supposedly died in an asylum. Interestingly, his dad supposedly was a riverboat captain and a fertilizer manufacturer. I have nothing to prove this, what I'm saying with this, but if he was a fertilizer manufacturer, was he exposed to all kinds of chemicals? What happened there? Is there anything like neurochemical going on? And when his mother got pregnant, and genetics and predisposition to prenatal trauma? Something to think about. We just don't know with certainty. Alcoholic brother. His father died when Fish was 5 years old. So his father was 75 when Fish was born, died at the age of 80. So that's the first kind of big trauma, that a loss. His father was more like a grandfather to him. So I don't think he had probably a deep attachment, obviously. His sister had a number of mental health problems. His brother was in a mental asylum. Uncle supposedly had mania, lots of alcoholism in the family, lots of things going on in that family of origin, where mental health, alcohol use, and among other things. When his father died at the age of 5, his mother supposedly didn't have enough money to take care of him. So at that point, he was placed in an orphanage. So abandonment issues come to mind, rejection by mom. At the orphanage, this is some of Fish's own accounts, he was abused beyond belief, exposed to horrific things, abused by the teachers, was severely beat up, whipped there. He had to watch terrible things. There was shame punishing going on. At that point, was there something that happened in his mind where he started to connect pain with pleasure? Because as you see, as he gets older, he starts connecting pain with pleasure. When he was at that institution too, he dealt with a lot of humiliation, torture, and there's some accounts as he got older, he got erections from beatings. So he started maybe associating some of these horrific things with something sexual in his mind. A few years later, after he was there for a period of time, his mother obtained a job and was able to retrieve him from the orphanage. But by that point, he was exposed to horrific types of trauma. It sounds like over and over again, by staff there, by the teachers, and by fellow individuals, younger individuals there. Another thing that really sticks out to me, at least from this literature, and these accounts, he sustained a head injury early on in life too. He had a severe fall from a tree, and he sustained a brain injury where supposedly it caused him some permanent problems related to headaches and dizzy spells. So those are a few things. So now we have dad trauma, dying. We had abandonment by mom. We had extensive trauma for multiple year period. And we also have a head injury history. Couple things. Again, most people that have these extensive trauma histories, abandonment, rejection, brain injury histories, never grow up to do the things he did. But he had a lot of things going on early on in life. I wish we knew what was going on prenatally. We just don't have those records. We don't know. But again, father supposedly worked in a fertilizer plant. By all accounts, I don't know what was going on with mom during pregnancy. But those are a few things to think about when you're working with anyone in the criminal justice, legal arena. Not just what happened to them early on in childhood, but what happened in utero too, because development happens at conception. Joe, any thoughts from your lens, criminology, R&R lens with any of these things?
Well, I haven't even started to reflect really on the R&R lens, but you were really checking all the boxes there, Jerrod, when you described his childhood, from the trauma of his father dying at the age of 5, the attachment issues, which were a result of his mother's abandonment, and then the traumatic brain injury, which resulted from that head injury. So, like I said, you are really checking all the boxes there. From an R&R lens, again, just hearing this information now, we all know, of course, that the risk need responsivity framework is really built upon Bonton Andrews' general personality and cognitive social learning theory, which is really all about social learning theory and this notion that all behaviors learn behavior, including criminal behavior. But again, if you just look at this through a social learning lens, yeah, you described alcoholic uncles and family members and dysfunctional family relationships. So again, even just from a pro-social, or in this case, antisocial modeling lens, I would love to roll up my sleeves and take a look at some of these other criminogenic factors, which undoubtedly contributed to Albert's criminal trajectory. Are there any other contributing factors, Jerrod, that you're either aware of or that you could speculate on, such as the fertilizer factory implications?
At the age of 12, he met a younger boy who introduced him to drinking urine and feces. So he started that. He was supposedly a severe stutterer as well. So he was teased really bad by kids. And I believe he got a nickname called Ham and Eggs, and just really teased, ridiculed. So now we have those types of traumas. As he got older, he started to develop, obviously, mental health problems, saw many doctors in and out of institutions. Some of the doctors' reports really say he had like an abnormal or psychopathic personality. He had an over-obsessive attachment to religion, and he believed that God ordered him to torment and castrate little boys. He had a history of pushing needles into his body. He had a history of self-injurious behavior, and there is some account from some of this literature that he would soak rags or cotton balls in alcohol and insert them into his anus and then light it on fire. I mean, what we're covering today is just scratching the surface. He had so many unusual, problematic, concerning, deviant types of behaviors. He, by all accounts, just really enjoyed his victims crying and screaming and being in anger. That's a classic Mysoped, where they really get aroused from hurting people, especially children, kids, and seeing that horror and agony. He's a sexual sadist. Difficult to know, did he meet criteria fully for psychopathy? Because obviously back when he was around, that diagnostic criteria was not around. But he had a long history of victimizing younger individuals. By all accounts, too, he had a tendency to target younger children who were vulnerable, disabled, and there is some notion, too, that he targeted younger African Americans as well, because he thought in his mind that if he targeted these people, no one would ever know they went missing. So he has a long history of targeting individuals. Now, the big famous case, if your folks are interested, that really eventually brought him into the contact with the legal system, and that's where he was convicted and sentenced to death. If they Google the case of Grace Budd, I won't go into detail right now. It's just too horrific. But you can go online and type in Albert Fish and the Grace Budd letter. He actually wrote Grace Budd's mother a letter outlining exactly what he did to her. And just a few things. Obviously, it tortured her and ate her over a period of multiple days. So it's very horrific stuff. But you can find the letter online. And he wrote that letter to Grace Budd's mother. I believe it was around maybe like 6 years after he abducted her, and really detailed exactly what he did. One thing I didn't talk about, too, that I forgot, I believe at the age of around 28, he got married to a 19-year-old woman, and he had 6 children. And one of the things that Fish indicated when he eventually was apprehended to the doctor who evaluated him is that was a big point. When his wife left him for another man, he really unraveled there. So he had a rejection or abandonment history with mom. His wife left him for another man. We have extensive trauma, rejection, abandonment. How does that all factor in here? Those are all questions to think about. At that point, he really unraveled, had more hallucinations. He really engaged in more self-injurious behavior, inserting needles into his groin and abdomen area. The list goes on. And there's some account, too, right around that time, he started really consuming huge quantities of raw meat. So some speculate he started developing kind of a taste for raw meat and cannibalism and things of that nature. And he would collect materials on cannibalism, and there's some accounts too that he would carry those articles with him at all times. So he was really consumed by this. So a couple other things we want to think about too. Did he obsess about this? By all accounts, yes. Rumination, perseveration, obsession. When we think of Mysopeds, we really want to think of fantasy development too. These things didn't happen overnight. Big factor with Mysopede literature is really understanding fantasy development. These fantasies probably happened and started out multiple years before he actually started engaging in the actual behavior. So he started reliving these things in his mind and growing and growing and growing, and eventually he carried it out. And then he carried it out even more and more and more. It almost became like an addiction to some sort of substance or chemical. Really look at it that way. So what we have now, just to kind of recap, we got some genetic things going on. Looks like some genetic vulnerabilities. An extensive trauma history. One of his brothers died early on in life too. So we have a sibling death. Bullied by peers. Father's death at an early age, and when his father died, his father was 80 years old and Fish was 5. What does that huge disconnect do in and of itself? Obviously, he had extensive attachment problems. We don't know what kind of attachment, but obviously there were attachment issues going on when you have this extensive trauma history and abandonment by mom, marital problems. He had the extensive childhood experiences of violence and victimization at the orphanage, possibly not ever feeling loved or wanted, the head injury history. And one thing I forgot too is he worked at various times as a painter. And at that time, there was no restrictions on lead paint. There's a few instances mentioned in this literature. Did he get exposed to lead paint as well? Fascinatingly, if your audience wants to take a deep dive into that, there's a whole number of studies that look at lead exposure and criminal behavior. Obviously, the studies are mixed. We just don't know. Did that play into this in some case too? Was there prenatal trauma? Was there sibling abuse going on that wasn't mentioned? That history of humiliation. So there's a lot of things that we just don't know. We know that there is a rejection history. We know let's just look at the general literature on sexual homicide offenders. Mysopeds are a subset of a sexual homicide offender. Most sexual homicide offenders come nowhere close to a mysopede. So mysopede is only a small subset of a sexual homicide offender.
I was going to ask you, Jerrod, about that topic of mysopedes. I'm intrigued by this now, and thank you for pointing out that this is a small subset. But would our listeners recognize other infamous mysopedes in history that now that they've got some background they may recognize in addition to Albert Fish?
Wesley Allen Dodd would be the other classic one that consistently comes up. There's a few other ones that are mentioned. I don't want to say their name now because I believe they're still alive. There's a whole long list I talk about in the training I've done on mysopedes. But Wesley Allen Dodd is a classic one. If you go to YouTube, there's videos on Wesley Allen Dodd. Wesley Allen Dodd, after getting apprehended, helped, I believe, write a children's book with someone talking about child safety. Very deviant individual, fascinating case. Wesley Allen Dodd, look at it. It's more of a recent case. When I say recent, I believe he got apprehended somewhere in the last 30 years ago. He's not alive anymore now. He also was executed. But that could be another case we could absolutely take a deep dive into. So that would be a really classic case. When we think, I'll just give your audience just a brief overview, maybe just because I know most people have not had really any training in mysopedes. It's just a very fascinating and scary case and just scary topic. But think of it as violent, sadistic fantasies. If someone's a true mysopede, you're going to have violent, sadistic fantasies. Most of the time they act alone. They typically engage in kidnapping of children they don't know. They may frequent malls. They may frequent playgrounds. I don't want to scare people with this. It is rare. It's not something that obviously is going to happen frequently, but when they do, it can leave scars in that community, obviously, for generations. Not good stuff. Rape, torture. The victims are most often younger children. The person has a tendency to depersonalize the victim. Sometimes, like Dodd, if we want to talk about Wesley Allen Dodd, he referred to his victims as garbage. Tendency to engage in dismemberment of the body. Sometimes they engage in necrophilia, cannibalism, and oftentimes they may keep a trophy or an object from the victim, or even remove a part of the body and keep that as a trophy. Not a lot of literature out there on this, but some common traits, and I've interviewed people all over the place. I've prepared for this mysopede training several years ago and just really talking to lots of experts, criminologists, sex offenders, forensic psychologists, and the common theme was, I've never heard that term. There's a few that have. Antisocial traits, going to be more common. They have a genuine desire to harm children. They get gratification from seeing that child in fear and terror. Homicidal fantasies, they have a tendency to want to humiliate the victim. They have a lack of attachment toward that victim. In most cases, the little research that is available, the individual is likely to be unmarried. We know that Fish was married for a period of time, but came more unraveled after his wife left him for another person. They usually have limited contact with children outside of the crime, but interestingly, Fish had children himself, and by all accounts, his children reported that he was a pretty good father to them, even though he was horrific to other children. Limited social competence, so lower level of social intelligence, social skill deficits are going to be more common, so they're going to be more likely to be a loner. Majority of cases involve males, obviously. There's been a few female cases out there, but the majority of these offenders are going to be male. And most of these individuals, at least all the cases I've examined, extensive early childhood trauma, disruption, strange things that happen in childhood. It's not like this just happened overnight. There were patterns over and over and over again. So those are just a few things. Joe, any other thoughts, anything you want me to go a little bit deeper into?
I guess my question would be, and again, I understand this went down in the earliest 20th century. We don't have records back then like we do now, but what type of or what sort of unanswered questions do you have, Jerrod, about the case of Albert Fish?
Love to know what was going on prenatally, genetically. Was mom using substances, prenatal care? Was there domestic violence going on in the household? I would love to know more about the fertilizer exposure. Did that have anything to do with it? Fish's exposure to paint and lead, was that something? Where did they live? Did they live near some sort of plant or factory where there's a lot of like runoff or pollution and all kinds of exposure? I would love to know the dynamics between his siblings and him early on in life too. Were the siblings really abusive to him as well? We know the abuse was horrific when he went to that orphanage. Was there abuse before that too? What was his attachment patterns like? It would have been fascinating to see brain scans from the head injury. What parts of the brain were actually damaged? Was that the only head injury he ever had? He fell from the tree, but if he suffered severe abuse and beatings and whippings, did he get beat in the head over and over? Was there multiple head injuries in his life? Did he use any types of substances? Those are just a few things that really come to my mind. Was he dealing with medical issues? Was he dealing with any other like challenges early on in life? I would love to have seen school records. Obviously, those records weren't really around back then. But again, most people who've had all these horrific things happen don't ever grow up to do this. Why did he? I think it's a combination between genetic factors, environmental factors, social factors, community factors, family factors that came together as a perfect storm. And it wasn't just what happened early on in life. Throughout life, he had a lot of different traumatic experiences, and he just continued to come unraveled.
As you've noted repeatedly, Dr. Brown, Albert Fish was a monster, and we're certainly not making excuses for any of these behaviors. But I really appreciate your root cause analysis, if you will, approach that you're taking to sort of, again, drill down on again, as I said, these root cause analysis of how this may have come about. To that end, talk about some potential training opportunities on the horizon for folks who may be intrigued again about what led to this type of horrific offense.
My good friend and I, the host of this show, and I are going to put together a 3-hour continuing education training program for the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies, and really take a deep dive into Fish's life and look at it through a psychological and criminological lens, and really infuse neurocriminology ideas, perspectives into this case, and really look at each facet of his life, dig deep into it, provide the audience with what the research says today. So if someone has a brain injury, what does the research say about that? What about attachment? What about prenatal trauma? What about bullying, abuse, humiliation, rejection? We'll also talk about just Mysopeds in general, talk a little bit about cannibalism, necrophilia, fantasy development. What about triggering events as well for some of these situations? That's something what was there a triggering event for this first one? What what might be some of those triggering types of factors. If you look at just some of the general sexual homicide literature and we talk about triggering factors, isolation, rejection, ridicule, low self-esteem, substance misuse, fantasy development, unresolved trauma, untreated mental health factors. There's some predispositional factors, biological factors, psychological, sociological, any unresolved conflict, that inability to handle criticism, just looking, and there's so many variables we're going to take a deep dive into. Now, most of us are never, ever going to come close to working with someone like an Albert Fish. But if we can just learn these basic principles, I think we'll be in a better position to look at red flag indicators of little things that may pop up along the way, red flags to be on the lookout for. Because if you're working in the criminal justice system, you're working with people with trauma, attachment, brain injuries, substance misuse. But again, most overwhelming majority of people, even all those issues, are never going to do these things. But hopefully taking what we teach people in this training and using it to work with any individual will hopefully lead to some better outcomes.
Yeah, great point. As you said, this was really an anomaly, to say the least. But if we can utilize the Albert Fish case study to illustrate some of these other common themes that the professional can use in their vocation, then that serves our training and education purpose. You mentioned that term neurocriminology earlier, and I know you and I have a conversation regarding neurocriminology in another future episode. I will endeavor to drop that one before the aforementioned training rolls out, so people can listen to the interview on neurocriminology lest they are perhaps thinking about becoming a neurocriminologist. It's a fascinating field, and again, ties in with a lot of the themes of what we've been talking about today. Anything else on Albert Fish and or the upcoming training? Or go ahead and give a plug to the incredible work you're doing at Concordia around trauma, resiliency, and self-care.
You bet. I'm the program director for a Master of Arts degree at Concordia University in St. Paul. It's an online degree program. It's a Master of Arts in Human Services with an emphasis in trauma, resilience, and self-care strategies. It's a multidisciplinary program, so we have folks in there from the criminal justice arena, human service, social service, mental health, and it takes a deep dive into the world of trauma. Trauma is a big topic. We talk about the adverse childhood experiences research, complex and developmental trauma, executive dysfunction, how trauma impacts special needs populations, how trauma impacts individuals who become involved in the criminal justice system. We talk about how it impacts the entire family system. We also discuss how it impacts professionals, like secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, burnout, compassion fatigue. So it's a really interesting program. We have wonderful students. Again, Joe, thank you for having me back and allowing me to talk to your audience about this really important and really dark case. And again, hopefully your audience walk away with some different thoughts, ideas. Again, there's a lot we don't know, but if we can learn these basic principles, learn about some of these red flag indicators, I think we can apply it to a lot of other situations. So hopefully we'll take a much deeper dive into this topic during that continuing education training, but feel free to share my contact information again, and I'll be more than happy to share some recommended readings if you want to learn more about Albert Fish or Mysopeds or some of these other related topics.
I will share your contact information as well as the excellent paper that you've written on the case of Albert Fish. Dr. Jerrod Brown from Concordia University. Jerrod, we love having you on the show, and I will promote the upcoming training that you referenced on the show as well. So listeners, stay tuned for that. Jerrod, we'll talk to you next time.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you, everyone.
A big criminologist podcast thank you to Dr. Jerrod Brown of Concordia University. As promised, I will leave Dr. Brown's contact information in the description of this episode. should you wish to reach out to him about that fantastic program he has at Concordia University around trauma, resiliency, and self-care strategies. Also, as promised, I'm going to leave you in a bit the information on the upcoming webinar we will be doing around Albert Fish. I want to point out, however, prior to that again, not doing this to sensationalize or glamorize or anything along those lines the horrific acts of Albert Fish. Rather, it's an opportunity to use this as a case study to exemplify some of the other learning we're trying to do here in the podcast. If you are a longtime listener, you'll know I've attempted to do this in the past, again, using historical characters or sometimes even fictitious characters to illustrate a point. Back on episode 28, I did a special Halloween episode in which I did risk need assessments around the Wolfman and Frankenstein's monster, for example. Episode 35, I did a reframe on Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, in which I did an assessment of Ebenezer Scrooge. I've even done a risk need responsivity assessment around the real life Henry Hill, who was exemplified in the movie Goodfellas. So again, using the notoriety around this case as a case study, if you will. Here then is that training description that Jerrod and I will be offering in July of 2022. This is a webinar. We are going to do a neurobiopsychosocial case analysis of the infamous serial killer Albert Fish. The training description is as follows. Albert Fish was one of the most infamous serial killers of children in American history. Described as a mysoped, sadistic pedophile, rapist, and cannibal, Fish has been the focus of gossip and conjecture since being accused of a series of crimes in the early 1900s. Fish's actions have been commonly attributed to both genetic and environmental causes. Designed for professionals, this 3-hour training provides a neurobiopsychosocial case analysis of Albert Fish's infamous crimes and behaviors. This will include an in-depth analysis of Fish through the lens of empirical criminogenic risk factors presented in the Fish case. The purpose of this approach is not to suggest specific interventions that would have abated the extreme behaviors of Albert Fish, but instead simply to highlight factors that attendees may recognize, perhaps to a lesser degree, in some of their clients. This endeavor has the potential to increase awareness and understanding of possible neurobiopsychosocial risk factors that increase the risk of problematic and deviant behaviors. Other topics discussed in this training will include adverse childhood experiences, for example, neglect, abuse, and other forms of trauma, attachment disruptions, peer victimization and humiliation, early institutionalization, empathy deficits, family disruption, fantasy development, lead exposure, severe mental illness, parental psychopathology, family rejection, self-conscious emotions, for example, shame, self-control deficits, social incompetence, and head injuries. Relevant research findings will serve as the foundation when examining the diverse topics explored throughout this training. Go ahead and follow the Criminologist podcast for updates as to this training, which will roll out on Friday, July 22nd at 9 o'clock a.m. Central Time here in the United States. Again, as this approaches, I will be giving updates and providing links to register in the podcast description. So stay tuned if you are interested in attending this webinar that Dr. Brown and I will be facilitating. Back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, the Paragon Group, LLC.com, for training or presentations as to evidence-based practices, program design, or, of course, the topic of desistance from crime. All previous podcast episodes can also be found at theparagongroup.llc.com. And if you have questions as to this podcast, hey, reach out to us via the Criminologist Podcast at gmail.com. That's the Criminologist Podcast at gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook page and our Instagram page at the Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You do not want to miss out. We are also on Twitter. The Criminologist Media Group can be found at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. Go ahead and give us a follow. You can connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn, and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Hey, lastly, if you have not yet done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. Merchandise is now available. Reach out if you are interested in scoring a Criminologist coffee mug, pen, or refrigerator magnet. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us. Ask them to subscribe to the podcast and do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
My good friend and I, the host of this show, and I are going to put together a 3-hour continuing education training program for the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.
The thoughts, statements, and opinions of the host and cast members do not necessarily reflect the views of their employers and are those of the host and cast themselves. Any discussion regarding client statements, behaviors, actions, or crimes are purely fictional and are used only for the purposes of example. Any examples that could be deemed to be related to an actual individual or individuals are incidental.